Well, there we are, Dax-Devlon Ross. How are you, sir? Thanks for coming back on the show.
My friend, I had to come off mute because I thought you were going to do your ramble, and then I was going to come off. It's already you caught me
it's cool.
off guard here. I'm like, oh God.
The ramble now starts. So
yes. Yeah. Okay. I'm going back to mute now, but thank you for having me back on the show, Joey.
You're welcome. Last we spoke, my friend, I invited you on the show to talk about your book, Letters to My White Male Friends, which was both a fantastic book specific to prose, but what it really helped me understand was your plight, your upbringing, some of the indignities you suffered as a Black man growing up in Washington, D.C. And I think that book helped me also understand a little bit about why you chose your profession, which is that of a lawyer who works in the DEI field and is trying to help diversity be part of our culture today, both within universities and corporations. We also talked a bit about the significant rise in DEI over the past decade at both of the universities and corporations, which we will obviously dive deeper into today. And then we discussed your specific approach to DEI, which we're going to get into at length today, versus some of the practitioners that I was asking you about. The Robin DiAngelos of the world who wrote White Fragility to much acclaim, and then Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist, both intellectuals that have big followings with their movements, both at the university level as well as corporations. And so for our conversation today, I would like to use the term identity synthesis in lieu of words like woke and identity politics. And the reason I mention that is because it was a definition coined by a young scholar at Johns Hopkins University named Yascha Mounk. And what I liked that he did to this is he said, look, I don't know how to name what we're talking about. And there's a lot of authors out there making jokes about, let's just call it the thing, or let's call it this and that. And why he called it the identity synthesis was because he said it's an amalgamation of postmodernism, postcolonialism, and critical race theory. And the ideologies of that encompass a lot of the beliefs of the cultural left. And I love that because everything I read about it really does kind of play into, the French scholars of Michel Foucault and Derrida and Kimberly Crenshaw and Derek Bell and all those folks in the critical race theory. So when I use that term, that's what I mean, as opposed to woke or the very divisive words that we're now using in our body politic. So I also wanted to, basically, as I shared with you off camera, I spent last 5 years reading as many books as I could, specifically on James Baldwin, Medgar Evers, Dr. King, W.E.B, Du Bois, Booker Washington, and then obviously Ta-Nehisi Coates. Yes,
Booker T.
Booker T. Washington. You're right. I did forget that.
Forget the T, man.
And then, over the last couple of years, conversely, I've read a lot of essays and books and critical thinking of Black academics that push back on some of these narratives. And some of these thinkers include Roland Fryer of Harvard, Glenn Loury of Brown, John McWhorter of Columbia, and then some young Black intellectuals like Thomas and Chatterton Williams and Coleman Hughes. Excuse me, both intellectuals and authors and thinkers that I respect. And so that's kind of, as I said before, to point to the obvious, I've spent the last 5 years of my life trying to understand racism in all its forms, its history and its perspective. And like anything complex, the more I study, the more confused I get. And that's why I like to bring on intellectuals like yourself to help me understand this. And then I want to start our discussion today with a fantastic book I read on race called The Nightmare and Dream, Nas, Jay-Z, and the History of Conflict in African-American Culture.
Oh, you did it. You just did it. You went where I was going to go. My God, you got it. Anyway, continue.
So there you go.
I'm like blown away. I'm blown away that you actually, we're about to have an amazing conversation. The fact that I only want to interject, and I know you got to get back to it, but I want to say when you were lifting up the dialectic between these streams of thinking, what I was going to say, had you not actually read my book, was that this is part of a dynamic that persists throughout the history of African-American thinking. So if we get caught up inside of it and thinking it is new, then we miss the entire point, because this is a pattern of relationship between Black ideas and their relationship to white and predominantly white mainstream America. They're always having to be mediated. These ideas are always in relationship to the silent partner in the dance.
Yeah.
So, thank you for bringing that book in.
Well, buddy, and thank you. It was actually my favorite book of yours. And for the reason that I mentioned now is that the framing of it was so cool because, to your point, this dialectic has been going on for hundreds of years, and these conflicts they're not new. And what I specifically liked, the way you frame this, is you said, is it's the complex conflict of oppositional Black icons like Biggie and Tupac, Jay-Z and Nas, which I thought was a truly clever way to frame this discussion. And the neat thing about this is that as I've talked to younger Black intellectuals and younger Black students, a lot of them listen and adhere to the poets, which these men were, right? I think a lot of people get lost in the genius of these men, specifically as social scientists. They are not just rappers. They're not just entertainers. These are big thinkers, and they're taking these really big constructs and they're bringing them down to layperson vernacular in the form of song and theme and dance and, cadence. And it's just beautiful. So I commend you on that.
And they're also in conversation with their ancestry. Like, that's the thing about it, is at a certain point in time, the reason why I thought Nas and Jay-Z was a really relevant conversation to interact with from this historical lens of conflict was that they very evidently were identifying themselves with different streams of the Black American journey and story. At one point, Nas was very much identifying himself with the story of Black militancy. And at one point, Jay-Z was very, forthright in his association with, Black capitalism and the Black ascendance, which goes back to Booker T. Washington and a pathway towards towards mobility and access to the American dream is through assimilation. And there's a belief there that if I can elevate myself, if I can be excellent, then I can actually become part of this larger American story, and I can transform it as well. This is why I love Jay, because he transforms it. I don't know if everybody's objective is to transform it, but you just got me going, man. Like, I don't even know. Like, I'm just like, thank you. It's just really fun. That book I wrote back in 2008.
Yeah.
And I always felt it was like I wrote it in like this dash of inspiration over like 8-month period when I tried to digest and process so much what I was feeling around the tensions I experienced in my own body, these tensions that I experienced in my own life. Having grown up a certain way, grown up and gone to law school and had friends and been in worlds where, the aspiration for ascendance and for enjoying the fruits of the American dream were very real and tangible. And, feeling as though there was incomplete work in this community, in the Black community. And some of it was connected to that immediate history that I grew up out of, which was the civil rights movement. And once I'm in that, I'm like, I can't just turn my back on that. I can't just leave that behind. So I find myself in this point of what I think a lot of us struggle with, which therefore breeds a sophisticated analysis, because that means I'm spending a lot of my time in my 20s and my 30s, and even my 40s, trying to understand what you've and others have spent a considerable amount of time doing. But that's just what I've been doing for my entire intellectual life, is trying to make sense of what it means to live in this body, in this world, and to look at it from different vantage points. Oh, man.
Yeah. No, and
so
that's
this conversation is important to me.
It is. It's important to me too, because as I've said, not just my friend, you're someone I look up to as a thinker, and so I lean on you for this kind of stuff. And so I think that, let me ask you this. You wrote in your book about nationalists versus integrationists, the dilemma. And can you help our readers, our listeners understand the difference between a integrationist and a nationalist?
I think nationalism is a phenomenon that is very present in our conversation, our global politics right now. Nationalism and national identity. And one of the things that Black folks in America have contended with is, what is our national identity, even in the absence of what typically constitutes the legitimacy of national identity, which is land. So even though we don't have land, how do we still create a national identity? Even though we're disrupted and dispersed and distributed, how do we have a national? And if we look at history and we look at the broader society, those cultures that are successful are ones that have a strong national identity and a shared sense of purpose and have some alignment and agreement around what they're trying to achieve, right? Mm-hmm. That is often seen as a threat in American society because it is perceived that therefore we are not assimilating ourselves into the broader American body politic. It is us not being American enough because we're trying to craft and maintain an identity that's connected to our Blackness. That's seen as a threat, right? But some folks feel like that's not just a threat. It's a survival tactic. It's how we've been able to even continue to persist to this day. Has been because we've created national identity, culture. Now that's been fractured, shifted, and changed over the industrial evolution, the migration patterns, and now generational change. And now there's so much diversity in our experience. I think it's harder than ever to really have a national identity. And that's okay. That's okay. But the flip side, to answer your question on the integration, is, assimilation is a synonym for the term, but the notion being, and that's what's often sort of identified around Martin Luther King's dream and aspiration, and why so many folks feel drawn to his "I Have a Dream" speech, and other folks feel frustrated that that's the speech that's always elevated to demonstrate who Martin Luther King was, because they want to say, but there was more to his story. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't integrationism in the way that you are presenting it as. You're presenting it as this two-dimensional phenomena, and it is much more layered than that. So it's like even the conversation around what it means to be integrated in American society, I tend to think is not fully embodied the idea of a person that we typically use to symbolize integration, that being Dr. King. Those two ideas have lived in opposition to each other. Mm-hmm. Some people I call it the nightmare and the dream. It's not my identity. It's not my own idea. It's an idea that's existed with other authors and thinkers. But this notion of how to be Black in America, do I accept that America is a nightmare or a place that I will never be fully embraced and at home, and therefore hold a national identity that will give me something to anchor? Do I see America as the dream that it expresses itself to the world as, and quite frankly, even there's plenty of evidence around me that proves it has the potential to be? Do I go in? And in order to be a part of that dream, what is historically meant is that you have to participate in the American idea, which is you got to go to college, you got to, you buy into American exceptionalism. You have to really kind of get into the you have to buy into those values in some way. Even Jay-Z does. Like, it's not as if he's lazy, right? He's pushing out albums. He's hustling. He's grinding. He's still, he's becoming diversely, and he's investing in all these different spaces. He's still expressing an American ethos around the access to the dream. So, I mean, I'm going to stop because I know I could keep going, but like, I want to just be responsive to the questions. I'm excited about where this conversation can go, and hope your listeners are, really appreciating what you have already done as a journalist. My gosh, man, your ability to like bring work into the space that I can react to and be in present context with you is special. So I'm excited for this ride.
Oh, well, thanks.
Because you did your homework. You you come correct.
I do my homework. That is one thing. I didn't do it in high school, college, so I figured I'd do it later.
Hey, bro.
So let me ask you this. Do you think then integration is also synonymous with assimilation?
It's a great question, man. I don't know what I thought back in 2008 and what I read.
Well, let me tell you what you thought.
Yeah.
I was too deep into Frantz Fanon and Franklin Fraser and the notions of the People's Revolution. So the reason I mentioned that, I was, this is 15 years ago you wrote this.
Yeah.
Do you still believe that piece? How much has changed in that 15 years for you? Because that was part of
I maintain an analysis of America and a critique of the country as not just as like an idea, but its practices legal, political, economic, social. I maintain a critique that I believe is my right, that I believe is my obligation, actually, as an American, to maintain a critique and a commitment to improvement. Right? I feel like as long as you have maintained a commitment to and a foot in the work and the struggle to make it more perfect, then having a critique is actually healthy. It is welcomed. I strive to be informed in my critique. I strive to be balanced in my critique, but I do still have a fundamental appreciation for what radical politics opened my eyes to, which is the notion that I operate within. America is a set of choices around how we're going to arrange our economic policies, how we're going to arrange our social policies. It's a set of choices. And those choices actually have been historically demonstrated to have benefited some folks at the expense of others. We have to contend with that. That's a real thing that has happened and continues to happen. And that is what that radical critique has allowed me to see, is that those folks who have been left behind, it wasn't because they were lazy. It wasn't because they didn't try and didn't want. It was because the opportunities weren't created for them. And as a matter of fact, it might have been structures that had been arranged to ensure their demise. That is a healthy critique that can move us. So yes, I do. And I think I continue to try to nuance it, develop it, and expand it, while I also continue to engage in my own accountability work as an American, as a global citizen, which is how do I contribute to making it better and not just criticizing.
Okay. That's a great answer. Thank you, sir. So you also, with regards to Du Bois' double consciousness, you wrote, "At the time, I was a burgeoning communist sympathizer who believed that class struggle was the roadblock to revolution. On some level, it was the recognition of Du Bois' contradictions, an elitist who celebrated peasant culture, an Afrocentrist who sat with Shakespeare, and in my own life that troubled me the most." What do you mean by that?
Du Bois' dialectic experience was challenging because I felt like one needed to be one or the other, really. Like you needed to actually, the notion that of the both and, I think it needed time for it to make sense for me. I needed time for that to be realized as a possibility, because I thought, I just didn't know that that was acceptable, that that was okay, that like one could be both of those things. So when I started reading and writing and thinking about things as a younger man, like I felt like I couldn't present it to my friends. I couldn't be an intellectual in these ways. I didn't feel like, I didn't know how it would be received. Turns out a bunch of them were as well, dealing with some of the same thing, but we didn't know how to bring it together and use it as generative building space. We were just all kind of like, but when we're together, we have to perform. Like we're performing a certain identity of Blackness, like the music we're listening to, the way we're vibing, but not fully sure. We don't know how to do those two things at once. So seeing it in those other spaces was destabilizing in some ways. It was like, how is this? I don't, yeah.
See, that's
destabilizing.
Cool. So now as a father, husband, lawyer, DEI practitioner, you see the duality of Du Bois differently.
Yeah.
You accept it now?
I think that I accept it. Well, no, first of all, there's no I think. I'm a much more humble person than I perhaps have ever been in my life.
Life does that to you.
Life does
sure
that
does.
to you, man.
Yeah, it does.
It humbles you. And I'm a fighter, I'm a struggle. I'm still a deep believer, and I'm a justice seeker. And I'm also I appreciate more of what it must have been like for him to be who he was on his journey. In that point in time when he was on his journey, it's mind boggling what he was up to and what he was doing. And without, real guidance or any kind of like model for having done it before, he was the first, and he did it for so long. I mean, the dude's evolution, Du Bois's evolution, even after the age of 50 is incredible. I mean, it's so funny, not so funny, but I don't know if you've been following, like this Senator Menendez situation, but he's been charged with being a foreign agent. Back in 1951, Du Bois was charged. He was at the age of 81 years old. He was charged with being a foreign agent under the same law that Menendez was charged under. And that time, Du Bois was running for Senate. He was running for the U.S. Senate seat in New York. And yeah, he was running as a third party candidate and he was likely not going to win. But the fact that the man even thought to do that and the government actually, they put up a phony case against him as an agent of a foreign government because he had been part of this, this peace treaty, this Stockholm peace treaty that they were trying to, disseminate across the globe to keep these people from blowing us up. Now that they developed these bombs, and he was conceived because he was a peace seeker, he was perceived to be a communist. So just when I started to learn more about his journey, which I've spent more of my time doing in the last decade as well, it's humbled me to understand, like, hey, people keep evolving. Don't lock them into a moment in time. Don't assume that because the people who are living in good faith, not in like bad, and when I say by good faith, like they're honestly facing the day every day. And they're honestly asking themselves the hardest questions they can ask themselves. And they're honestly willing to revise the ways that they've seen the world based on new information. This is what I saw Du Bois continue to do. And I hope that I could do that with my life. So I'm much more than you bring in fatherhood. I mean, I am humbled I woke up this morning, 2-year-old on one side, 4-year-old on the other side. My wife's in New York on vacation and I'm just trying to hold it together. Like I slept, they're like all over the place. And I'm like, we fought to a draw last night. It was a draw, and tonight I have to get ready for another battle, right? That I do not know if I'm going to win, No,
it's wonderful. I'm ahead of you. I got a 12 and a 10-year-old now. So I've gone through that. I got the battle scars to prove it. But yeah, it's awesome being a daddy.
Yeah, it really humbles you 1,000%.
You actually write in this specific to Booker T and Du Bois, you say, rather than negotiate a truce with the Du Boisian sect, Washington chose to fight them, tearing Black America into irreconcilable ideological camps that were both ironically funded by white patronage. Since the power struggle with Black Americans has become increasingly fractious, and yet the either-or paradigm continues to exist. So that's where I was, when I was reading that, I was like, he's still not a big fan of Booker T. Not in the pejorative sense, but just his ideology versus Du Bois, right? It's more of the, that's why I was asking about the assimilation piece, because to me, what I gleaned from your writings on that was that he leaned into more of that. We need to be more white. Not, he didn't say that. This is my inference, but like, we need to cooperate more as opposed to pushing back, and I think that was kind of where
the cooperation, but the problem with the cooperation, and not to cut you off, is that he was also saying, lessen yourself for now. Shrink yourself. Allow yourself to be in a subservient role. And that and if we perform well in this subservient role, then we will get more access. And I think my resistance to that is, but what have we already been doing?
Right.
Why do we need to continue to play this? What further, why? And I think the resistance that Du Bois has is to that as well. He's like, how can you ask this of people? But then I think Booker T is like, well, if I don't ask this of you, we will be slaughtered. We could be, I think that's the other existential component here, is that Booker T. Washington is definitely aware of the existential threat that is posed by Black folks physically resisting in potential. Like, you will not win that battle. But then sometimes the objective isn't to win. Maybe it's to, do something else.
And what I loved about this specifically was, you mentioned earlier that this has been going on for hundreds of years. We've had this division, even between the Black communities, right? And so that's kind of where me as an outsider looking in and trying to figure all this complexity out.
Yeah.
I look at intellectuals, as I mentioned. Do you look at someone like Washington, Booker T, Du Bois, Frederick Douglass? I mean, and this is what I even have in my notes. I see similarities between the rivals of Ta-Nehisi Coates and Glenn Lurie, as an example, right? As far as the way they look at the world. And then Ibram Kendi's versus Roland Fryers of the world. And these are all men of letters.
The same pattern.
Yeah, they're all men of letters. They're all, I think, dignified human beings. I don't see any dunking. I don't see any name calling. There's no ad hominems, but there's a real divide between, the Black intellectuals that I was first drawn to. And then after, like any good reporter, you try to figure out, all right, well, let's go look and see all of the other thinkings and machinations of what's going on there. And I think that's a piece of what I think is really important. And that leads me into some of the questions you, go ahead.
No, man, I think what you're, I want to hear your questions, but I have found the very reason, I have found it harder for myself to engage in some of the public debate. It's not like I've been writing more stuff about this and engaging, because to me, and I don't mean this to be dismissive of that, it's to say, like, that is noise, and that noise has always been there. So the question becomes, for people like me, it becomes, what is your work right now? Your work isn't to you understand that is actually, there are people who are deciding to publish these points of view. There are folks that are deciding to present them in panel discussions and to feature them in articles. These are all decisions that aren't necessarily connected to me and aren't necessarily, in my view, even really reflective of the greater issue that we're trying to contend with, and probably the broader streams and currents in which folks actually have commonality and share commonality. It's a focus on these differences as a way to create another wedge, to wedge divides, and to create a broader perception that there is, not this broad support for social justice initiatives that it appears that Black people by and large are seeking. By elevating, and I've talked to you about this, by elevating ideas held by, I'd love to see the data that would contradict what I'm about to say, but are decidedly minority point of view, even in the academy, as it relates to these questions of sort of the Black experience, Black intellectual, engagement, sort of the Black product, whatever you want to call it. Like, there are significantly more voices that are on this, that are articulating a point of view that it critiques America and offers a pathway forward that is grounded in some kind of recognition of past harm, whether that is reparations or some other forms of policies that are designed to do redress work. That's where those folks are. It's not to say that we don't have an internal critique that we need to deal with as Black people. It's to say, let's look at the material conditions here. The material conditions on the ground tell us this. If you look at the life cycle of Black people in America, Brian, if we are data-driven people, and we say that we're data-driven people, then let's look at what the data tells us about infant mortality, maternal mortality, education outcomes, wealth access, job access, wealth accumulation. Let's look at what the data shows us, and let's just focus there. Right. And the data tells us a story. Now, if you're trying to tell me that the reason that the data is the way it is because of cultural factors and behaviors more than it is a result of system and structural decisions that we can decide to make different decisions around, then I have a problem, right? Because then you're saying it's about me and it's my fault that I'm poor. It's my fault that I am, that I haven't had that great education. It's my fault that my parents and my family are distributed across whatever that might look like. We're not intact. It's my fault. And I'm like, we know from Trading Places, man. If you saw Trading Places back in 1982, that's all you needed to understand about the world. And you would know that if we no, just joking. I don't want to be silly about it, but I don't want to be glib.
No, it wasn't really, it wasn't a really shining example. It worked. Even for my little brain, I was probably stoned when I watched the movie, but it did clarify that for me.
No, and it's not to diminish the hard work. And again, I know that what happens then is this becomes this question of like, how do we reward exceptionalism? How do we reward people who work hard? And I work hard at people who work harder than me. I want to, be a benefit to society and be a benefit to my family financially and otherwise. I get that. And so I know that I'm not pushing for a society in which people are not rewarded, for their efforts and for their achievements and I'm not pushing for that. I am saying that we have plenty. I'm just saying that there's plenty. We have enough. We got enough food. We have enough space. We have enough that we can actually create more for those who have not had as much. And our quality of life, and those of us who are worried about the fact that we will not be rewarded for that is not a necessary outcome of providing more opportunity for more people. Those two things are not in opposition to one another.
No.
And so if I don't hear those guys on that other end of the spectrum able to engage in that sort of nuanced, sort of discourse, I tune out. I just tune out. I don't really listen because I'm like, we're having strongman arguments. We're just talking in the Tower of Babel. We're not actually grounding this in, and who people really are and how people actually show up in the world. And I struggle with those. I struggle with that perspective, even within the Black currents of thought that I respect. But then I also at the same time have to say, for real, man, can we just keep it real? Do you really believe that? If I were to take you around this country and put you in all sorts of communities, would you still hold that point of view? Really? I don't know if you would, man.
And that leads,
then, go ahead.
Here's a situation. You wrote in emails that we were talking about. I said, hey, bud, I want to, talk about some shit. I want you to talk about some shit. You just said, what I'd like to actually talk about is indoctrination and speech policing of the hard right, which presents this as a justification for pushing back on DEI and framing it as anti-democratic. And I thought that was a great conversation for us because it continues what we're talking about now. Obviously, most folks of reason don't have, well, I shouldn't say that. Most folks of reason agree that DEI has meaning and merit and a place in our culture. The detractors, however, are very vocal that it is poison, that it is indoctrination, that it's wrong and anti-democratic. So, give me some examples there, what you mean, what you're coming from, because this is why your expertise as a subject matter expert is so important. It's what you do. This is what you spend your life doing, and you have spent your life doing. And so you are a credentialed, successful businessman in this realm. What do you see when you talk about, let's just say, hard right politics as it relates to DEI? What does that look like when you say indoctrination? What does that mean?
So fundamentally, what the right doesn't want and doesn't like when it comes to critical race theory is the injection into the American story of a view that there has been a structured pattern of exclusion of people of color, particularly Black people. It finds that fundamentally repulsive, repugnant idea. And because it finds it repugnant, it pulls off the shelf this idea of freedom to think and free speech rights as a means to deflect and defend its territory without having to fully acknowledge that that we are not operating in a society that doesn't already have a set of beliefs that have been in many ways adopted by some group of people. And those beliefs that they, are greatly informed by, Judeo-Christianity, greatly informed by obviously the Adam Smiths of the world, greatly informed by, the industrialists of the world. Like that is an ideology too. And it is an ideology that has been defined by people who have been direct beneficiaries of there's sort of like the beneficiaries of American dominance. It's worked for them. It worked for Henry Ford. It worked for the
Rockefellers and those guys.
The Rockefellers, the robber barons of the world. I mean, that's one term they used to describe them. And so, therefore, I think there's an unwillingness to engage with what Howard Zinn would call the people's history that needs to be added to the prevailing story and a concern and a worry that by adding that story, we somehow will lose who we are. I actually hear and do believe these people, that these folks on the right, they don't just fear like the displacement of the narrative, but they fear that by adding in a story by officially acknowledging the imperfections of the American story in the ways that critical race theory is asking, it is in some way going to be, it poses an existential threat. They perceive that just the mere integration of those ideas is somehow going to destroy America. And I've tried to take that as seriously as a real, like when I hear it, it feels inflammatory and hyperbolic, but I'm trying to take it actually serious. They do believe that it will destroy something. So what is it they are worried about destroying? What is the concern of destruction that they're speaking about? Well, I tend to think that it's directly connected to not just wealth and the overwhelming sort of, the overwhelming wealth held by folks who identify more disproportionately with the hard right. Like if you look at the proportion, and not just wealth in terms of dollars in the bank, but land, all those other things, power. There is a threat that it's a human response. I think it's a group response. We talked about nationalism earlier. It is an actual response that then will be rationalized thereafter. Like I feel like there's a response that's now being rationalized as one that needs to be, met with the utmost force. And therefore we will need to, construct our Supreme Court in such a way that's going to express an increasingly minority point of view. We need to construct our Congress, and what we're seeing in Washington right now, I think, is a preface to more of what we will see in the future around the fracturing of that party and the capture of the far right of that party, and that party's that faction of the party's willingness to disrupt the entirety of government in order to get its way. Mm-hmm. This is what's happening, and so the pushback of the use of this idea of indoctrination is very, very, it's effective, but I also feel like it's also disingenuous. To me, I connected directly to the 1950s. I've spent a lot of time studying the McCarthy era, and in many ways, it follows a pattern of the ways in which anti-communist fervor overtook the American mainstream consciousness for a period of time. I see similar patterns what was happening in 1949 and 1950 and what's happening in 2022 and 2023 in this country, in this moment in time. Like the hysteria around DEI, the hysteria around racial justice work, the notion that people who comprise 12% of the population plus our allies, who, by the way, we've been here as long as anybody else and only have worked to make this a better country all the time. We want to now just blow this shit up. Like, I want to destroy it all for my own children. Like, is that really what you think I'm up to right now? You don't think so what you're saying to me is that we have not contributed in any positive and effective way. And we have not, when provided the opportunity, helped make this place greater. And so that in this context, you think that what we're up to right now is solely about trying to undermine, disrupt, displace. That's all we care about. It's like insulting. It's like, man, that's a very minimal, it's a very limited view of what we're up to. So I look at that indoctrination argument that's being presented, and I do think that it's being now framed as anti-democratic. Like DEI work is now synonymous with being work that is antithetical to democracy. And it is antithetical to democracy because it shuts down dialogue. And it shuts down dialogue because it requires people to engage in some kind of groupthink. Right. But that premise but that's based on a premise that what we're up to and what people like me are trying to do is do that, which is insulting, which is like, that's what you find that's what you take away from my interaction with you, that I'm here to indoctrinate you, make you believe things that are not true. Wow. I get emotional around that because it makes me feel like wow, when my folks were, when my folks who were slaves found out that they were, that they could fight in this war, in the Civil War, they in every war that they've had an opportunity to fight for, they line up in droves and droves and droves and droves. And don't believe for a moment those people are not fighting for justice for their own, not just for the American flag. They're fighting for what it can be. So if you try to say, well, they were just there to fight. No, they were there fighting for their own too, because we've always had a multiple objective. I mean, think about, during World War II, it was the W.E.B. That was because out of World War I and because of the Red Summer of was in 1919 when all these black soldiers came home when they were abused and beaten and killed across the South after World War I. The only way that folks would get on board, like some of the intellectuals like Du Bois in particular would get on board with black folks supporting World War II was under the W.E.B campaign. Victory abroad, victory at home. They had to find a way to make them both end and make it make sense for them. But we don't talk about those kinds of things, right? We just say, oh, he was a patriot because he went to fight in World War II. No, he went to fight in World War II, and he was doing that so the fight back home was going to be an easier one as well. Don't erase that story, but we erase it all the time in order to uplift our idea of the war hero, right? The war hero only cared about, the flag, only cared about the, and so that's, you've reduced us again and reduced our motives again. And so I'm now feeling reduced as a DEI practitioner to having these very simplistic motives, these very base motives. You've worked with me. You've interacted with me.
Yeah, dude, I know. That's exactly why this is so important. And I think just to move this from, the abstract and they, let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Christopher Rufo recently wrote a book, which I read. And
I haven't, but I've read.
Yeah, it would be tough. It would be tough. It was called America's Cultural Revolution: How the Radical Left Conquered Everything. And for our chat, I went through my highlights of the book, and chapter 3 is entitled "The Long March Through the Institutions," and it's exactly what you're talking about. It's indoctrination, and that's a big theme to his book. Yeah, and he writes at length about Marcuse and Michel Foucault and Derrida and all of the intellectual thinkers specific to that. And then he actually weaves that into the Stokely Carmichaels, Angela Davises of the world, who are criminals, right? Which he intimates throughout the book. And then he quotes here's a quote he wrote from Marcuse talking to Ruth Dushki. Says, "Let me tell you this, that I regard the notion of the long march through the institution as the only effective way now more than ever." And then he continues to write specifically the professorships of people like Angela Davis and Eldridge Cleaver as examples of this indoctrination specific to the left. And this is where our schools now are fully indoctrinated to left, far left, as he calls it, the radical left, in that these institutions are teaching things to children. And it's not just universities that are exactly what you talked about. He calls this indoctrination. So my question to you is that Christopher Rufo, for those who don't know, is a very loud voice on the conservative right, who is a member of the Manhattan Institute and scholar,
which is a center right,
very center right. Yeah,
probably more right than center.
Okay, and then he is also the ombudsman for Ron DeSantis. And in Florida, he spent his job, and he spent years actually articulating the branding and messaging of critical race theory. And he's attempted to adopt a lot of these, anti-woke bills with Governor DeSantis in Florida, and much of which was shot down, by the way. Greg Lukonioff talked about this at length, and he's the president of FIRE. They're losing these battles, by the way, as you know, as a lawyer. But I think the bigger piece is, when you talk about indoctrination,
we're not losing. But let's be clear, we're losing these battles not because of the arguments that we're making, but the fact of the judges that are deciding. It's not that they're losing.
No. I'm saying Rufo's lost, right? So Rufo and
I thought you were about the court cases. I thought no. For the court cases,
Rufo and DeSantis have lost those. Yeah, and they're based on that. It's unconstitutional. Like, you just can't. Yes. And that's why FIRE, Greg Lukonioff, for anyone who hasn't listened to him or read his books, he's a phenomenal thinker specific to free speech. And so what he's talking about and fighting against Christopher Rufo's and the Ron DeSantis of the world, the reason I broached the subject is that those to me are approximate. Those are examples of people that are indoctrinating or believe that the cultural left is indoctrinating deleterious ideas and ideologies to our kids.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on, I don't think I have, it's a big stretch. What are your thoughts?
No, man. No. I think, well, first of all, like I'm interested. You did such a great job of just like asking the questions. And I'm also interested in how you react to some of these things as well. I mean, I interact with someone like Christopher Rufo as a person who's operating in bad faith.
Okay.
Just as I do the same thing with Ron DeSantis. These folks have been around. They're more sophisticated. They're not, maybe there's other things going on. I don't know necessarily with them as characters and human beings, but they are choosing to adopt a view of the world and of their opposition that is, at least that's unnuanced, that is inaccurate, and I think is intentionally misleading to people who they know are not going to read deeply, are not going to do necessarily their own factual research, in part because they've already been primed. And what I mean by primed, they've already, like the same way Pavlovian, we talk about Pavlov's experiments, we've been primed to respond to certain terms and to certain arguments. And again, I go back to thinking about the 1950s and 1940s as an example. The word indoctrination was one that was dog whistled all across the country when Hollywood actors and screenwriters were being blacklisted and other figures were being blacklisted. It was the reason it's the Salem witch trials. It's every time we've seen, it's the know nothing. There's been a pattern and a history of people waving the indoctrination flag as a form of misdirection. It's to get folks to be focused on things that are, that are emotionally triggering, to get people like worked up, and in ways they're not able to actually spend time to sit down and break down and make sense of. Like, for instance, if you were to ask someone, could you define woke? They would struggle. What do you mean by, how do you define equity? Couldn't do it for the life of them, right? Yeah. If I ask these very basic questions, fine. And it's not because people aren't smart. It's because they have been told throughout their lives, and they probably resist the notion of anybody telling them anything, because we're all independent minded, free will benefiting human beings who are not influenced by anything in our lives. We're all just sort of figuring it out on our own. But what I would argue is otherwise, which is that part of why you as a man in your 50s come to spend that much time with the thinking of Black writers is because throughout early part of your life, it was not presented to you as worth your time. Mm-hmm. I go to a lot of people's houses and I don't see, I've seen more and more recent years, absolutely, more writers of color, more women writers. I remember checking my own library at one point in like my 30s, like, do I not read women like that? Like, why are the majority of my books men? What's going on here, bro? It was like a moment I had to like check myself. And, I've read Toni Morrison, I read Audre Lorde, I read, Zordnia Host. I read the Black women, but I didn't do that. And I think there's a resistance sometimes to just do that. Just do the simple reflection, just to simply ask and reflect on without being emotionally, like, see where you go with it versus trying to like apply judgment to it all the time. And I find that when Rufo is speaking and he's getting that kind of response, it's, rooted in, and I've done enough work with people to see this over and over again in my spaces, is that they just haven't thought very deeply about these things. And he's offering them something that is very familiar, something that feels good, right? And that conforms with the view of the world, right? And he's done it at the right moment in time, because there were people that were beginning to question and challenge themselves and go deeper. And what he provided was for those folks who were feeling some folks who were feeling some disequilibrium and who were looking for an anchor to get them back on solid ground. He gave that to them. Other people like yourself said, I'll engage with you, but I'm not going back. I don't know where, I don't mean to assume you were somewhere else before you started this journey. But what I'm suggesting is that there's enough there that you've explored and that you've encountered to allow you to, I think, want to continue your own growth and inquiry without hardening into a position that is actually so impactful on the lives of so many people. Like, to hold these positions that they hold is to hold, whether it's about reproductive justice, whether it's about trans justice, whether it's about, it's about actually dimming another human being's life prospects.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My view of Rufo is that, and I don't know, I don't speak to his intent. What I will say is that I think he believes everything he says. So I've studied him, I've read his books, I've watched his lectures, and I don't believe for a moment that he's a grifter, right? He's not trying to make a living doing this, but what I do see in everything he does is the pull of audience capture, right? For part of his own financial success. Yeah, his own brand. He admits fully that his job as a very influential thinker and very smart young man too, that he recreated the branding and messaging of critical race theory in the pejorative. And that was his mission. And he did that and encapsulated that through his relationship with Ron DeSantis in Florida. And that to me is where I see the party, the GOP in general, glomming onto this narrative and this ideology that CRT is dangerous, that intersectionality is dangerous, that DEI is dangerous, that all of these, educational tenets specific to understanding race in America and the origins of oppression and systemic racism are bullshit. And that
it may not be bullshit. It may be that it's also divisive. I don't may use the word divisive or divisive. So it's more that I hear that it's bullshit argument, but I think that its bullshit argument is less prevalent than it's not helpful for us right now. Like, it's actually pulling us apart. It's actually creating more tension. It's creating, and in the workplace, it's actually getting in the way. Why people will abandon the workplace is getting in the way of us being able to be closer together. We need to be more bounded together. Right. So I don't want to disagree necessarily with the notion that they're dismissive of the ideas. I also feel like,
well, I mean bullshit in the same way. I mean bullshit in the way of that it's not what they being the deification of this, but they being like, hey, part of what comes across from the cultural left is that, and you can see this on the cover of magazines, Mother Jones had, a recent cover that said, we're back in Jim Crow and, we're similar to this. And there's a lot of these narratives on the left that are fodder or chum for these thinkers on the right, who will then take that and say, hey, look how radical these people are. And so that's what I mean by that. I don't think they, for a moment, dismiss what took place in our origins. I think no one admits that, slavery and chattel slavery was maybe the worst thing that's ever happened to us. And so that's not what I mean. I want to be clear on that. But I think that specifically with these narratives, they're powerful because they are shared, to your point, to a citizenry that is difficult to grasp. So like our citizens are busy, right? They're working 2 jobs, 10 hours a day, that kind of thing. And so someone says, I don't understand what's going on. And then someone says, oh, listen to this smart young man. And so they do, right? And that's where the indoctrination piece comes in. And so, yeah, but the thing is, to me, what I struggle with is how do they, how do those who find themselves responding to these ideas not identify themselves as being indoctrinated? Why is the indoctrination only a one-way street? That's like, it's like from an intellectual being, I'm like, I would need to do some point of reflection and ask myself, hold up, am I maybe being indoctrinated? Like, do you just only allow for the indoctrination to exist if it's external to, what you perceive to be the right answer, or to feel like it is actually an accurate representation of reality, and everything else outside of that has to be considered indoctrination? To me, this is why we talk about a failure. Well, I think we, as an education, as a society that cares, if we do care about education, I have this pet argument that no one probably else otherwise,
agrees with me on. No one else thinks it's important, but it's mine and I care about it. But I think we focus too much on developing a critique in our way that we teach young people to think and not an analysis. And by that I mean is like, I find that there's opinions everywhere. And they're about, as thin as like, a sheaf of paper, but they're everywhere. But when you ask folks for analysis and to be able to follow any kind of reasonable or at least recognizable pattern of analysis that they can arrive at a conclusion with, and we don't do it. And I'm not just saying this as a judgment, and not even saying that I do it always as effectively as I would like to be able to do it. It's like, it's not a skill that's taught. And so if you ask people to think about their own thinking, like to even reflect on one's own thinking about it, to be metacognitive about one's processes, how you arrived at conclusions, what information did you discard versus information that you let in? Who did you decide to give attention to when they were talking versus who did you turn away from when they were talking? When Dax was on TV, did you just turn the channel because you assumed that he had nothing of value to say to you? But and do you acknowledge that part of how we have come to be informed as people who identify ourselves as black, white, brown, or whatever is racial identification? And it baffles me and will always baffle me that when someone like this emerges and they present an argument that people begin to glom onto, and those are the same people who were being challenged to think about themselves and to reflect. There's not a conversation about that. Like, isn't it ironic that the very people who are having a hard time with the way the conversation is going now have found this other thing that they can use, and they're calling that not indoctrination. And I'm like, this is why I have a hard time taking these people seriously. And I'm like, let me get back to work.
Well, that's exactly it. And I think one thing, and we'll get into some of your DEI stuff because I have some folks I want to throw at you, but I agree with my answer to your question is that it's tribalism. That's the answer, right? So for me, historically, when I was too lazy to actually look at the ballots, before I voted, I would literally just click on anything that was Democrat. I didn't look at the candidates. I was like, bang, Democrat. Where'd you come? Democrat. Or ask a liberal friend of mine, hey, what did you vote on that bill? I couldn't discern the language. Oh, vote no. Right, because the language was gobbledygook half the time. Yeah, right. Yeah. They say things like, "So true. If you vote for this, that means you hate babies." And I'm like, "I hate babies. Why? I don't hate babies." Right. And so you're worried about, if I vote for this, they're gonna torture babies. Yeah. So like, I don't understand what this language means. But yeah, I was part of that. Right, I was part of that. And I think as I kind of moved out of my career in media to journalism and understanding stories from a evidentiary perspective, that changes everything, right? And that actually gets us into the next piece. You want to look at tribalism, and you and I talked about this. The affirmative action ruling, the Students for Fair Action lawsuit against Harvard and UNC is an example of this. It's everywhere. It's polarized. It's on the left, on the right. Everyone agrees with their own story. And for those who don't know, it was a lawsuit filed by Asian Americans against Harvard and University of North Carolina, specifically in that they were claiming discrimination based on their ethnicity of being Asian. And to truncate this whole, it was pretty complicated, but we pulled some public records on this, specifically with the expert witnesses on the plaintiff's side. And there's a gentleman, a Duke scholar, professor named Peter Arcadino-Cano, and he basically showed through data that they did discriminate against them. And there were test scores for Asian Americans that had to be significantly higher to compete in elite colleges. And what he talked about, and what a lot of the folks talked about specific to the ruling, was that unlike what we were talking about earlier, where black and white people can share the resources, it's not pie. There's plenty of it for everyone. Yeah. What they were saying about this specific case at the elite universities, that it is a zero-sum game. So that if you do say, hey, you Asians, which we see too much of a percentage of, we want to make sure there's more diversity, we're going to discriminate against you. They did this, and this is what they were found in the Supreme Court. So again, then you thought, I have my liberal friends saying, oh my God, we've dialed the affirmative action back 100 years. We're going in the wrong direction. This is Russia, and all the stuff that I heard from my friends on the left.
Yeah.
And the reason I wanted to broach this topic with you as an academic and intellectual is that a lot of what got lost in this mainstream media was that this was an Asian thing. The plaintiffs were Asian. This wasn't a black and white thing as much as people wanted to talk about it. And the reason that I mentioned it to you as an important piece to our tribalism and what we're fighting about is that and this is what we can talk about now. One of the pieces that is not discussed really in the press was that they held an exclusion out for the military as an example. Say, hey, we believe that diversity is really important in the military. And that was the most perplexing piece for me, specific to the rulings from, the Roberts Court and Justice Clarence Thomas himself. And you're looking at that and going, okay, so if it's valuable to the military, why? And that was what I wanted to get your take on. Why would they create this piece versus, because I agreed with the ruling, to be clear, on what they did with the Asians, and then my bias I have to throw in. My wife is Chinese, and I've been part of a Chinese culture for 15 years now, and this is a culture that does study unbelievably hard. My wife's parents came from Taiwan, and they were poor, and they were ridiculed for their accents and their eyes, and they did not come in a good place, right? They earned, they worked really, really hard to be where they are today. And when their children then apply for school and they're being punished based on ethnicity, that bothered me. So I just want to say that. But the idea around the idea around this holdout specific to the military is what I really wanted to get your take on, because that was, as I said, that was perplexing to me.
There's so much there.
It is. I just dropped the bomb.
No. I mean, this is a very, I'm going to try to speak truthfully and to some extent in draft form.
Okay.
And while I thought about this, I would also try to avail myself, just kind of express the way I, makes sense for me. I think about to respond to the military exclusion, I think then that demonstrates even further that was an ideological decision. And so if I was a plaintiff, the sort of, the bittersweet aspect of the decision is that it had to come with a court like this. That this court had to be the one. That a court has demonstrated that it is not worthy of the integrity of the Supreme Court. And that is just my position on it, whether it's about its politics relative to racial justice and reproductive justice to speech. The list goes on and on. This is a body that is lost in legitimacy in the minds of so many, many people. And we have to do something about it. We have to do something about it. We have to do something about the Supreme Court. So I say, this is not a sore loser saying, but I think that it's like, we just need to be thoughtful about if this was if you want the decision that the folks got under the conditions that you got them, I would argue that I would want to have it heard before a more impartial body of decision makers, and they are not that. So that aside, that's connected very much to them, and that's actually demonstrated, I think, and illustrated in stark relief in that decision to exclude the military, because it ostensibly says, like, you provide an opportunity for us to do what we want to do. That's what you're providing. But what we're not going to do is put our nation's military and our national defense in jeopardy. That should tell you something right now. That means, therefore, you might be a tool for a larger enterprise that may not be one that you want to be a part of in the larger scheme of things. And this is what I always try to say to my folks who aspire to be part of this sort of idea that they have of the American dream. Be careful, right? Be careful. Be careful. There are many ways to achieve joy in the American dream. I find it actually really sad and disappointing that so much emphasis is placed on Harvards and the Yales of the world for what people perceive to be an idea of success. There's intelligent, brilliant people all over the globe, all over these college campuses everywhere, incredible professors. I think there's far too much attention that we just pay to these top tier universities. There's too many of these folks are in Washington and in the administration. I just think it's imbalanced. It's not imbalanced right now to have so many people from such a small educational environment that they educate such a small percentage of us.
Mm-hmm.
And they pride themselves on limiting supply to drive demand. That's my other problem with them. And I'm not the originator of this argument. I get it from Gladwell. He wrote an essay back in the 2000. I forgot what is it. Was it the one he wrote? He wrote about, it was back in 2015. He wrote, it was part of, it was connected to a season on his show, on Gladwell's, podcast. I'm not forgetting and blanking on the name of the podcast right now. It's such a great podcast. But in any event, it was one of the seasons he focused on higher education. And, he really, he's such a Canadian in this regard, but he looks at our American systems with such peculiarity. He's like curious about why do we do it this way?
Mm-hmm.
Why have we turned college into this kind of commodity in the first place? Isn't the objective to make sure we have the most intelligent, population? And if that's the case, and if Harvard could offer more places because it has the resources to do so, well, why don't you just offer more places?
Right.
Why are we forcing us to have this absurd conversation? It's only because their value and the value of institutions like them is driven by artificially limited supply and our willing participation in a rigged system. So I'm looking at folks and I'm saying, are you that pressed to participate in a system that is designed to not succeed for everybody? I'm not. And I actually think that, but putting that aside, that is my view. And I understand other people are entitled to have their view of like what it means to go to Harvard, what it means to go to these highly selective schools that only a certain number of people can get in because they've artificially, triggered, deflated the number of folks that can get in because they need to maintain a U.S. News and World ranking. Well, actually, many of them are leaving the U.S. News and World ranking, but even still, they recognize their value is as a brand that very few people can have access to. And to me, that's an elitist notion that I'm in conflict with, that I struggle with. And in my own life, I have children that I am raising that I want to have as good, as strong an opportunity to succeed as possible. I don't believe that it's necessary that they go to Harvard or Yale or those schools in order for that to happen. But what I don't also want, and I worry about, is a society that only values those institutions, or industries that only value those institutions. And I think that's why it puts us all at odds with each other. It puts us in conflict with each other. It creates more division among people who have more in common. And so it disappoints me on that level. But it's not right if we're going to have this system. If we're going to use an admissions system that we're saying is supposed to be fair, it is not right that it discriminates against, in any way, it discriminates against any student, and especially Asian students who are striving to go to those institutions. So that's my feeling on it. And I am now witnessing, and we talked about it, like that decision is going to become the bulwark of a host of other decisions that had nothing to do with students getting into Harvard, but it used as a convenient tool, that lawsuit, to now unravel a very tenuous set of opportunities and access points that people who are not part of, they're either not wealthy and don't have access to wealth, and or come from disproportionately disadvantaged backgrounds, don't have the same access to.
Right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, man, you sound great.
Okay, cool. No, because my earphones are dying, and I just want to make sure you can still hear me. So
no, man, you're good.
I know historically we've talked about Roland Fryer in the past because I'm a fan, and I've read a lot of his reports and his books and his thinking over the years. Here's where you guys agree, I think. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I don't know if you read his article. It was called "Build Feeder Schools and Make Harvard and Yale Pay for Them." So it was a really cool article in the New York Times. And for my readers who didn't read this piece or not aware of it, let me just read this for you. If they aren't enough Black and Hispanic applicants who can perform at the level of college would normally require, the thinking goes that schools should drop some key measures of performance in order to admit those students anyway. But this is precisely backward. Instead of making the admissions process shallow, elite colleges should deepen the applicant pool, which is what you just said, right? Yeah. The simplest, most direct way to do this is for these schools to found and fund schools that educate disadvantaged students. This argument has allowed elite colleges to sidestep responsibility for far too long. They could fix the problem if they truly wanted to. Elite colleges could operate a network of, say, 100 feeder middle and high schools, academies that are open to promising students and otherwise lack access to high-quality secondary education in cities where such children are common because of high poverty rates and underperforming public schools. A back-of-the-envelope calculation demonstrates that affordability isn't really a serious question. The Ivy 8 league schools combined, to say nothing of other highly selective colleges, have endowments worth about $200 billion and counting, a figure expected to exceed $1 trillion by 2048, and enrollments of around 70,000 undergrads. I have no doubt that underrepresented minority students can achieve at the highest levels. In Daytona Beach, Florida, where I was born, I often witnessed gallons of talent wasted, brilliant minds rotting in boring classrooms, and precocious lives cut short because of routine violence. In the types of private schools that my children attend, I often see teaspoons of talent perfectly nurtured. If we treated talent in Daytona Beach the way we treat talent in elite private schools, inner city students could compete with any kids across the world. And the reason I like that, and the reason I thought you would agree with that, again, I'm not putting your words in your mouth, is he's saying a lot of the same things you are, that they're being way too, conservative in how they bring
precious. They're being too precious.
Yeah, they're not on purpose, right? They brag about.
Well, there's been lawsuits. There's been lawsuits. I think there was an antitrust lawsuit back in the 80s around price fixing. I think that there's elite university, Ivy League schools engaging in forms of price fixing. That's not, at least the allegation's been made. I don't know I think there was a decision, like one of those out of court settlements. They all paid some amount of money and recreated it, I imagine, in some other shape or form. So the idea of a consortium, that's coming. Look at, they're like the NBA. They're like, any of these, they're a cartel. They're a cartel by any other name. And so to change the way they operate would actually be writing the wall, writing themselves out of relevance. They'd be, to change that would actually, it'd be existentially, it would be an existential threat for them to do that to themselves. I do not imagine that they would perceive it to be in their interest, at least in the prevailing environment, to engage in that kind of proactive decision-making. I think it's a lot to say that some of them are at least sidestepping or moving out of the U.S. News and World Report, as for ranking measures. But I think to go to the next level, what you're talking about, I think there's a pathway to get there. I don't disbelieve that radical change in the orientation of institutions of higher education, such as Harvard and Yale and the others of that ilk. I do believe that can happen, but it would require tremendous leadership courage, vision, and quite frankly, it would have to encounter tremendous resistance from many of its own people and the very people who have funded the university themselves.
Question. Yeah, no question. And I think that's what I wanted to share too, because we often talk about the divide of our policies in our political tribes. But the one thing that is consistent with all of the aforementioned academics, right? John McWhorter, Glenn Lurie, Roland Fryer, all those cats they all believe the same thing you do, in the sense that we need to get education here quicker to children of need. It can't start at 18. That's not where you kind of intervene, right? And specifically, like you mentioned, the top 2% of the schools, right, would have these lofty ambitions to keep people away. Harvard has a 4% admission rate, and we're very proud of that. You're like, great, that's not something to brag about, right?
it's not something to brag about.
No, and I think that and the weird thing about that is that that's where, for me, if we're actually looking at remedies as opposed to battling each other, that's where we have some commonality in both parties. Agree with that. And so, like, the idea that Fryer has, as well as McWhorter, as well as Glury, is they all say the same thing, is that we got to educate our kids quicker. And we dealt with this, again, proximate versus abstract.
But I mean, these are, I just got to pause. Like, that's not a new idea. Like, it's
no. But that's one we all
the idea that if what they're adding, I mean,
which is rare,
on being at the front end of the education experience with a daughter in preschool and a son who's in Montessori. Like, so I'm watching a number of things. I'm watching parents early on make decisions about where they're going to send their children, what school, what side of town, all sorts of, all things are setting up the next move. It's like a game of chess. And what it does is, and what we've done is, as a society, we've turned it into this, it's another form of the Hunger Games. And we're indoctrinated into a Hunger Games mentality about education and therefore those families that could choose to stay and strengthen schools and the communities in which they live. And I'm not saying they should, I'm saying that they could, they have the means to do so. And one of the means by which they might need to do it is by creating a community of people who make some kind of commitment to invest and be here, which I think happens in some environments. The alternative is that people, just kind of every person for themselves, and like get the best education you can get for your kids, and like, then enrich it with some activities after school, and you do this, that, and the third, and blah, 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 blah. I mean, I understand that all bets are off for people when it's their children.
It changes, because I can tell you, as someone who deals with the lottery system here in San Francisco, our children go to a mandated immersion school, and their academic rigor is really high. And so it's one of those things where, if you look at what took place here in San Francisco, as well as New York City recently, they have two public schools that are of very high esteem. Lowell here in San Francisco and Stuyvesant in New York City, both of which have about a 70% Asian population in the school. So they're being criticized heavily for that, by the way. And so they removed the testing criteria for both schools. And it was a disaster. And this is an example too, buddy, is of when I watch this stuff, even as a liberal, I'm like, no, that doesn't work. You can't take kids, in this specific circumstance, it was African-American and Hispanic kids, and they put them into this really rigorous academic program on both coasts. And these young men and women were then known as the lottery kids, which got really cruel and shitty, which kids can be.
But how is that different than what happened in colleges 40, 50 years ago? I mean, this is what was happening with the first students who arrived at Yale en masse as a number. The first ones I guess what I'm suggesting is only just that isn't, to some extent, we should have, we've got data to demonstrate that this was likely going to happen. But does that mean we abandon it right away? Or does that mean we then understand that there's going to be a recoil initially, and then there's an opportunity, but the recoil effect might kick in over a fire? So what did we learn from the experiments, the places that have seen success? What did we learn from those? So I haven't gone to a place gone to Sidwell Friends, a Quaker school in Washington, D.C., considered a, fairly rigorous curricular experience. It is now a majority minority school, right? Which is really interesting. That's awesome. I didn't know this, but and they have not seen a diminish or loss in their academic rigor or in their academic performance or the college acceptance rate. That they have not observed any of these negative impacts. But what they have done is, and I'm not saying that they've gotten it all right at all times, but they certainly have not, but they've been in a committed relationship with diversity for half a century at this point.
And that was my question. And did they get that training ahead of time? Right? So they didn't come in at 14 and then say, oh, now we're going to start to teach you how to think and how to learn and how to read. Right? That's the bigger problem.
I definitely think. I definitely think so. What I think, in my experience, and I only have my own experience to back it up, I think that high school's too late to do those kinds of, to do
I
that.
do too.
I think honestly, what my experience was, I made the transition in middle school. And what I will reflect back, when I reflect back and think about it, what I experienced in that time was, there was academic rigor, yes, but it wasn't such far, the gap wasn't broad, there wasn't such an extreme gap that I couldn't catch up in the places where there was a gap. But moreover, what was even more important was the social relationships that were being formed, so that I had people to study with, or people who wanted to hang out and help me, or I can help them. And so I think about how we do that integration in those kinds of environments. There needs to be, I don't know, did you create a mentor system for those young people? Was there some kind of structured way in which they were going to be connected with somebody? I remember in law school, that was what happened. I got to law school. You get like a buddy right away and who's going to guide you through and support you. Did they do that here? Was that part of the way? Because I know it's not just about your ability to show up and do well on a test. There are a lot of people who could probably do well on the test, but there were a lot of other things that got in the way of their being able to do well. And it wasn't just that they didn't know the material. And so I don't like the argument being presented that they couldn't meet, that it was strict, that whatever success we didn't see was a function of them not being academically prepared. Because I don't think that the academic experience is the entire experience that people are having in high school. There's a social experience. There's a familial experience that's happening. There's a variety of there's adolescence development experience. And so if we only want to point to and say, oh, they couldn't keep up academically, I think that's actually, we're telling a lie. Because then we're excluding all the social factors that they might have been experiencing. How long did it take you to get to school? 2 hours. Had to take 4 buses. Had to get up at the crack of dawn. Haven't done this before. All of that stuff matters. And if we only look at how they do on the quarterly, at the end of the year academically and say whether they were successful or failure or the idea was a bad idea, I think we've missed the point. And so I don't agree that changing these policies to create more opportunity for more young people to get into high schools that are more selective is a bad idea. I think the way we have decided to determine what is worthy of access, like what should be seen and what should be evaluated for the point of act, is too narrow. I think only focusing on I just think that's too narrow. I think it's not a reflection of how anybody operates in the workforce. It's not a reflection of what our society needs. I don't need people who I'm not saying this is what young people are. I'm just suggesting that there are other things and other aptitudes that we need to start to actually value and begin to score and to give credit for, because that's what keeps our society going. We don't just function because we got smart people. We function because we have kind people, and we have empathetic people, and we have people who show up for other people. And all that shit matters. All that shit matters.
It does. And that's why I love talking with you, man, because that's number one, I don't know exactly how quick we pulled the trigger on this, but it was quick. So we did not measure all of these, these multivariate pieces to this pie. And when you mentioned the bus, it's funny you mentioned that, because that's one thing specifically that took place this morning. So I got up this morning to take my son to soccer practice before school, and our garage door opener doesn't work. There's something wrong. The thing came off the chain.
Okay.
And I said, so we come back up, and I said to my wife, I got to get my notes together for my podcast today. I can't get kids to school. I said, can you take Kingston to school, who's 12? And their school is all the way across town.
Yeah.
But yes. So my wife said, oh, let's go, bud. And it was 8:00, and his class starts at 9:30 because he normally has soccer practice in the morning.
Yeah.
So he's like, why do we have to leave now? She says, well, because we're taking the bus. And he said, okay. I don't know if my son has ever been on a bus. So they got on the bus and they went about 2 miles, and then they're going to take a connecting to a subway to get to the train to his school.
Yeah.
And they got out of the bus and the subway was broken down. And so they came back out of the subway, and they stood in front of this, this donut shop with a bunch of, punks laying around, and drug addicts, which I'm sure you've heard about in San Francisco. There's a lot of drug addicts here. And so there were people laying there in their own pee and, on fentanyl. And so like my son was traumatized by this. Like he was saying, and I talked to my wife, she got back. He's like, Mommy, this is gross. What's going on? And she's like, babe, our son's so spoiled. And I was like, oh my God, I didn't even think of that. So to your point is that it took them an hour and 10 minutes to get to school today. And then it took my wife another hour to get back on the bus. So she was gone for 2.5 hours. This is an example of what you just highlighted, which I didn't. And I've said this to even my wife, our children are so spoiled. You know, they get in their overpriced SUV and they listen to their music while their daddy drives them to school. And I pick them up at soccer practice and we nurture their environments, and they have chess and they have music and they have books in the house. And like, that's a very different piece. And it would be probably to your point, and I actually will dive into this a little bit more, is like, how fast did we pull the trigger on these schools like Lowell and Stuyvesant? Because it didn't work. You know, was it a month? Was it 6 weeks? It wasn't more than a year. That much I can tell you from my own reporting. So
this is the whole thing with
longer to do that, you know?
Yeah, of course it does. I say this all the time. I watch us as a society make investments that don't yield benefits and gains in all different aspects, in all different sort of walks of life. I see companies make investments that don't yield returns. R&D departments are like an accepted form of an accepted sort of sunken costs quite often in organizations, knowing that they might be one great idea that will then help fund the others. But we're going to sink a lot of cost into these things.
Yeah.
I guess the point I'm just trying to make is that we give up too quickly on things that are hard.
Yeah.
We give up too quickly on things that are hard. And especially when they're hard in the way that they challenge us to reevaluate values. They challenge us to be, you know, our higher selves, like more generous, more graceful, more all these things. Like, and it's not our fault necessarily, because we live in an indignant society. You know, Indignation, you know, is one of my favorite Philip Ross books, but it's like the sort of indignation that people had around the shifting of these policies at these schools. Like, how dare these schools let these Black and brown kids who are not as intelligent or not as hardworking as mine? That's what I heard, indignation. And the ease with which indignation is like cast upon Black and brown bodies. Like, we're totally like, it's like, these are still young people. These are still, oh, they can go to some lesser school. I wouldn't have a problem if this wasn't a feeder. Stuyvesant wasn't the feeder to the creme de la creme. And if we're saying that we're going to be a society run by the elites, if we're saying that we're going to be a society run by elites, then we need to make sure that those elites really reflect the diversity of who we are, and not just like in our singular performances in one or two academic subjects and our ability to do great extracurriculars. But there's other things we have to figure out how to measure, because we need other capacities and capabilities in our world right now. We need more of people who can cooperate and are willing to cooperate and work together. We need more of, you know, folks who are willing. At this point, I'm worried about teachers. I'm worried that we're going to have a teaching profession in 20 years. You know, we need more of that. And that's going to require more of us as human beings. And it's going to require us to look beyond, you know, our own individual selves. And I will say this, I've spent some time with some younger folks, you know, I have nieces in their mid-20s and younger. And I actually think a lot of them are built different. I think a lot of them are built a little bit different. I don't think they're all as selfish and there's an entitled component, absolutely, right? But I find that there's a recognition and a value of diversity. There's a value of their friends, the difference amongst their friends. There's a desire to work in places that reflect and respect diversity and are inclusive. That's not going away. That's just going to get stronger.
Yeah.
And so if there's any argument for why we need to keep doing this work or why this work, because these young people aren't going to have it. They see the world. They know climate change is necessary. They know that, you know, that we're moving towards like a more green economy. They know that in order to survive, we're going to have to change the way we live. They know. I'm not saying that they're the most brilliant beings and they've figured it all out, but I do think that we are missing it if we're not realizing that they are the ones who are going to be dictating our workspaces, political landscape, and whatever else have you in the years to come. They're a big fucking cohort. They're engaged with each other, if nothing else. So we can keep having these we can have these adult conversations all we want. Keep talking about a bunch of old people chirping, and keep trying to fight shit and hold shit back and block all this. And you can't keep doing that. You're sowing the seeds of your own undoing, because these young people are watching you. They're watching us.
And I think they believe the same thing that the Supreme Court believes on the diversity exclusion for the military. It's necessary So my kids go to a school that is approximately 10% white. It's lots of Asians, and I mean Asians in all of the Filipino, Indian, Chinese, Japanese, African-American, Hispanic, and they love it because they've never done anything else. They've gone to a Mandarin immersion school since they were kids. Yeah. And their elementary school was 5% white. And so for us as parents, we recognize that. And I think that, to your point, I couldn't agree more, is that the younger generation is going to save this for us, because us out here pontificating about what should be done, they're like, nah, it's in front of me. I see it every day. I see the importance of this. And if I can't get my friend to study, because my buddies, my kids, their friends all study just like they do, right? There's a lot of rigor in their households. And so to your point earlier, it is about the community. It is about, modeling this behavior, not just from the parents, but from the village in which they're raised.
I think in which they're raised.
Yeah, it's very important.
Bro.
We got to let you go, man. I know, but we could keep talking forever. I'll let you go way over. And again, bud, this is why I love talking to you, because I learned so much. And that's the hope with my listeners, is they learn from you as well. I know you got a lot going on. I know you went over your time today. So thank you so much.
No, man. Joe, I get weird. I feel weird at the end of these conversations, because I always feel like, damn, I hope there's something in here, all the rambling, that there's something of value to your listeners, to you. And I just want to say thank you, man. And I say this with utmost sincerity. Thank you for taking the idea seriously. Thank you for taking me seriously as a thinker and as a contributing voice to a conversation that's not only in your head, but it's amongst your audience. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time thinking about and talking and sharing, and, I consider you a friend, and I wish the best for the show, and not for the show, for the company, for the brand, for the company, for the idea.
Thank you, dude. I really appreciate it. I'll give you a hug if I could reach you from DC, but thanks a lot for coming.